A lot of people think once you've got $2 million saved, the retirement question is over. It isn't, because Alex and Cathy Ferguson are both 61 years old, they've got nearly $2 million invested, and they want to retire today and spend 10 grand a month. Now, Alex and Cathy are hypothetical characters, but the situation we're about to walk through is very similar to conversations we have with Canadians approaching retirement every single week. And when we ran the numbers, the answer wasn't nearly as straightforward as you might think. So today, we're going to stress test Alex and Cathy's retirement plan 6 different ways and find out whether they can retire now or whether one wrong assumption changes everything. It's your favourite Scotsman here again, and after helping hundreds of Canadians prepare for and transition into retirement, I've learned that retirement plans rarely fail because of the numbers themselves. Most often, they fail because of the assumptions behind those numbers. And Alex and Cathy's situation is a perfect example of that. On the surface, they look like they're in fantastic shape. So, let's meet them. They're both 61 years old, the mortgage is paid off, the kids are grown and financially dependent, and after decades of working, saving and investing, they've accumulated just under $2 million. About $1.55 million in RRSPs and another $240,000 in TFSAs and roughly $180,000 in a non-registered investment account. Now, they're standing at a crossroads that many Canadians eventually reach. Do they keep working, or do they finally pull the plug and retire? Because they're ready for that next chapter. More travel, more family time, more freedom. Catch is, they want to spend about 10 grand a month after tax in retirement, or 120,000 a year. And that's where it gets a wee bit interesting. 2 million on the surface sounds more than enough. But before we start stress testing the plan, let's look at the simple math most people use to answer this question. Using the 4% rule, that would suggest they need roughly $3 million invested. They don't have 3 million, they've got 2 million. So based on that math alone, retirement does not look particularly promising. But the first thing we need to remember is that Alex and Cathy aren't trying to generate the entire 120 grand from their investments. At age 65, both of them will start receiving CPP and OAS. So the real question isn't how do we generate 120 grand a year, the real question is how much of that 120 grand needs to come from the portfolio. And when we account for CPP and OAS, the gap becomes a lot smaller. In fact, when we ran the base scenario, Alex and Cathy's plan supported annual spending of roughly $115,000 after tax per year. So, they're only about 5 grand short their goal. Not bad for a couple that the 4% rule just told us they needed another $1 million. At this point, retirement is starting to look very achievable. But before we celebrate, this is where retirement planning gets dangerous. Because a plan can look perfectly fine on paper, right up until you start stress testing the assumptions. Let's start with inflation. In the base scenario, we assumed inflation averaged 2%. Let's increase that to 3%, just 1 percentage point. When we reran the plan, sustainable spending dropped from roughly $115,000 a year to about $107,000. Think about that for a moment. Nothing changed about Alex and Cathy. Nothing changed about their portfolio. The only thing we changed was inflation. Small assumptions can create very different outcomes over a long period of time. And this is exactly why retirement planning can feel so overwhelming. A 1% change in inflation just reduced the sustainable spending by almost 8 grand a year. Now, if you're sitting there wondering about how your own retirement plan would hold up under these kind of assumptions, I've pulled together a free retirement guide that walks you through many of the same questions we ask when helping clients prepare for retirement. You'll find a link in the pinned comment below. Back to it, and before you start worrying that Alex and Cathy aren't going to make it, there's another assumption worth challenging. And this one actually works in Alex and Cathy's favour. The plan we've looked at so far assumes they'll spend roughly the same amount every year for the rest of their lives. But that's not how retirement works. Most retirees spend more in their early or go-go years, the travel years, the golf years, the years where health, energy and mobility are still on their side. Then spending often starts to slow down, not because they're forced to cut back, but because life naturally changes. So we ran the plan using a more realistic spending pattern. About 120 grand a year until age 75, then roughly 112,000 until age 85, and about 103,000 after that. And suddenly Alex and Cathy's retirement looks a lot better. This is one of the biggest mistakes I see people making when planning for retirement. They assume spending is a straight line. In reality, retirement often comes in phases. Now, of course, retirement planning would be a lot easier if it followed a nice, predictable spreadsheet. Unfortunately, it doesn't, because there's one fear that keeps a lot of pre-retirees awake at night. What happens if I retire and the market crashes? And it's a fair question. After all, Alex and Cathy are about to stop earning a paycheck and start relying on their investments. So let's stress test the plan again. This time, we'll assume the market falls 20% just before retirement. Everything else stays the same. When we reran the base numbers, the sustainable after-tax spending dropped from roughly $115,000 per year to just over $101,000 per year. That's a drop of nearly $14,000 a year from a single market event. Now, does that mean Alex and Cathy can never retire during a market downturn? No, but it does highlight something important. The first few years of retirement matter a lot, because when you're taking money out of a portfolio that's simultaneously falling in value, the damage can be much harder to recover from. That's why retirement isn't just about having enough money, it's about having enough flexibility. Now, so far we've been talking about market risks, inflation risks, spending risks, but there's another risk nobody likes to think about. And honestly, I can understand why. Because it has nothing to do with investment returns. It's nothing to do with inflation, nothing to do with the stock market. It's the loss of a spouse. When most couples picture retirement, they picture it together. Trips they've talked about taking, the family gatherings, the extra time they'll finally have with each other. But a good retirement plan has to account for life's difficult realities as well. So we asked a tough question. What happens if Alex passes away at age 80? Now, some expenses would naturally decrease, but many wouldn't. Property taxes don't disappear. Home maintenance doesn't disappear. Utilities don't disappear. And at the same time, there'll be loss of Alex's OAS and most of his CPP. So we reran the plan assuming Alex dies at age 80. The good news is Cathy is still able to sustain spending of roughly $88,000 per year through age 95. Now, that's obviously less than the $120,000 they were originally hoping for, but that's also the point. Retirement planning isn't just about building a plan for when everything goes right. It's about building a plan that can survive when life doesn't go according to plan. So can Alex and Cathy retire at 61 and spend 10 grand a month? The answer is probably. But not because they have nearly 2 million, and not because some retirement rule says they're ready. What this exercise showed is that retirement isn't determined by a single number. It's determined by the assumptions behind the plan. When we looked at the simple math, retirement didn't seem realistic. When we factored in CPP and OAS, things improved. When we increased inflation, the plan became more challenging. When we used a more realistic spending pattern, the outlook improved again. And when we stress tested the plan for a market downturn and the loss of a spouse, we got a much clearer picture of what retirement might actually look like. And that's the lesson there. Two people can have the exact same amount of money and end up with completely different outcomes. Not because of the portfolio, but because of the plan. There's one takeaway from today's video. Just don't ask whether a certain number is enough to retire. Ask whether you've tested your assumptions. Because retirement planning isn't about predicting the future perfectly. It's about making sure you're prepared for it. If you'd like help thinking through your own retirement, don't forget to download the retirement guide. If you're sitting here thinking, this is all great, but I've nowhere near $2 million, then you're going to want to watch this next video that asks, can you retire on just $500,000 in Canada?